Hi everyone, welcome to Module 6 of Kinesiology 2700, Stress Management for Healthy Living. This is Module 6, How Change Happens. It's based on the work from Unstressed by Dr. Elaine Doherty. Hi everyone, welcome to Module 6, How Change Happens. So how we're going to start first is I'm just going to ground you just a tiny bit in where we've been, because I know I've done that enough. And then we're going to talk about how change happens. Next week, we're really going to start switching gears and, okay, so now what do we do about it? But so far we've been talking about, we talked about what stress was. We talked about that you have two drives that kind of are always, one or the other is always in control of your physiology, your whole mind-body complex, and they work together because when your physiology, again, your whole mind-body complex, including your thoughts, your emotions, is always dominant in one or the other. So you're either feeling good and seeing the world through that point of view, or you're not feeling good. You're in your fear response and you're seeing the world from that point of view. And again, there's kind of shades of gray, so it's not like two extremes, although it might be, but one system or the other is always dominant. We talked about that you can't be in both drives at once. We talked about that the one that you are in most often is the one that flourishes. In other words, it just gets better at what it does and creates a greater capacity to be in that drive. And so you have your fear response system drive and you have your calm and connection system. And then what I did is I really broke down what the fear response system, what your fear response system looks like when it is in control. We talked a lot about that. We talked about the whole spiral of becoming under your fear response system. We talked about all the different pieces of your spiral of becoming under your fear response system. And then we talked about an approach to stress management is that it has to be a two-pronged approach. It's not just about reducing the chaos of your fear response system, but it's also about actively cultivating your calm and connection system. And again, next week, we're really going to switch gears and really get deep into practices about how you do that. But we just have kind of one more piece of the foundation before we can kind of switch into the tools, deeper into the tools of how you do that. And that is that how that spiral of becoming changes or creates change in your life when it's a calm and connected spiral, right? So I said you have these two different systems. Each has its own spiral of becoming. So every moment of every day you're transforming to something. And so you're either transforming to a more dominant fear response system or you're transforming to a more dominant calm and connection system. And so now what we're going to do is look at what happens to that spiral of becoming when your calm and connection system is in control and how it really creates the change that most of us are looking for when we're really trying to work on reducing our stress or work on creating greater emotional resilience. And so again, I want to just ground us back in the spiral of becoming, that every moment of every day you have a perception. When you have a perception, you automatically make meaning of what that perception is. Now, again, a lot of this is subconscious. A lot of this is going on without you knowing it. You just feel something and you kind of attach whatever meaning that feeling comes along with without ever necessarily really noticing it. And then the moment you attach a meaning to it, you have a physiological response that is consistent with that meaning. And then the all-important arrow is that goes back and influences what you're perceiving in that very next moment. And again, this goes on every moment of every day. It's a split-second process. The BRC is behaviors and reactions and choices that you have from that. And we've gone over this quite a bit. But now we're going to really talk about kind of how it changes when you begin to change your experience. Because again, as I've said many times, nothing changes if nothing changes. And so the only way to begin to change the spiral of becoming is to change your experience, either to change your perceptions or to change the meaning that you're making or to change your physiological response. And this is a hugely important piece right here, is it has to be an authentic change. So in other words, you can't just pretend you're not perceiving what you're perceiving, or you can't just pretend that you're going to create a different meaning. And this is what I always say, positive thinking doesn't work unless you believe it. And so the idea is, how do you really deeply change those belief systems so you really rewire a different way of being, rather than just trying to pretend you're not feeling the things that you're feeling, or you're not perceiving the things that you're perceiving. Because your body, your whole mind-body complex, is way more connected to your subconscious mind, to what's going on, the real truth of what's going on for you, not what you're trying to talk yourself into. So the idea is you have to go back to that place of your deeper truth, of what your real experience is. But the good news is that you can begin to change that real experience with little shifts. So it's not about trying to force yourself into something that you don't believe or think. It's about really authentically making little shifts that you begin to absolutely, from a foundational way of being, really begin to see and be differently, which is a very, very different concept. Okay, so providing new meaning, what does that mean? We're going to talk about how you begin to change up the meaning that you're bringing to this whole process. Okay, so and that might be just replacing, there's going to be a lot of different ways that we talk about this, right? So it may be replacing your response patterns. It may be bringing your attention to your inner chatter in a way that you haven't before, and all of a sudden realizing, wow, I'm really saying a lot of negative things all the time, and just beginning to change your thought pattern. It may be really authentically going back and kind of changing some of your deeper perceptions, and we're going to talk a lot about how you do all of that stuff. But when you begin to change up that spiral, again, this talks about that any moment in that spiral, you can begin to shift that spiral so it becomes an upward spiral instead of a downward spiral. So what happens when we do that? We actually create a new physiological imprint. And again, so in the spiral of becoming, under that bubble that has the physiology there, we begin to change our neural reactions, we begin to change our electrical reactions, we begin to change our biochemical reactions. And remember, every moment of every day carries a physiological imprint. And any time that you carry a physiological imprint, you just get better at that thing. So in other words, it's like exercise. The more you do it, the better you get at it. So anytime you carry an emotional imprint, the better you get at it. But again, it's not about talking yourself out of it, but it's about authentically creating a different emotional imprint, and then your body begins to adapt to that. So we're going to talk, and again, next week we're really shifting in, so how do you apply all these skills? But right now we're just going to talk about kind of what are the changes that happen when you can begin to shift that spiral, either by switching your meaning or healing some of your perceptions, or even jumping in at the physiological level, stopping. Last week we talked about the power of pause. We're going to get much deeper into the power of pause this week. And then next week we're going to get even deeper into some other tools. But every time that you do a tool, every time you do the power of pause, every time you did that mindful smiling breath, every time you listen to one of the longer guided meditations, you're actually stopping the process of spiraling out of control with your fear response system and switching it so it begins to form a different foundation from your calm and connection system. So we're just going to talk a little bit about how that happens And then I'm going to lead you more into, you know, kind of a little deeper into learning the power of pause. And then in the next module, we're really going to talk about, okay, so how do we really make all of this work for us? So again, when we begin to shift our meaning, when we begin to shift the perceptions that we have, then we create an entirely new physiological imprint. What does that look like? So one of the things that we talked about a lot about is about your neural nets, right? Your neural nets connect to any experience that you have. And so we talked a lot about how they connect with your fear response system. You have a negative experience in your life, and your neural nets wire to that experience. Remember, the neuron itself kind of looks like a little hairy wire there. And then one neuron by itself doesn't do anything, but it connects to many, many, many different neurons. And those neurons basically make meaning for you. The neurons in your brain carry your programming. Okay, that's how you think, that's how you respond, that's how you have an emotional experience. And the more that they connect, remember they connect to each other and transfer information, the more that they connect, the better they get at those connections. And so, you know, I talked about if nothing changes, and experience begets more of the same. And so I talked to you about two different ways that happens. Your original perception, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, but also that every time you perpetuate the same behavior, all you're doing is refiring those neural nets in the same firing patterns, and they're just getting better at what they do. The more they fire together, the more they wire together. But the good news is there's something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means if those neurons stop firing together, they actually stop wiring together. The neural connections will actually break off and die. So when you begin to change your experience, or when you begin to replace your old experience with a new experience, the old neural connections actually don't form connections anymore. This is how true change happens, right? But again, it's not just talking yourself out of it. It's like really authentically having a new experience. The neural connections of the old experiences begin to break off and die. And then you form totally new connections. So neuroplasticity was something that wasn't, we used to think, and we used to say this all the time actually in the world of neuroscience, once you're hardwired in a certain way, that means you're just going to be that way, right? And so we didn't find out until the mid-1990s, which in the world of neuroscience isn't really all that long ago, that people could actually change their brain. We never knew that. We thought once you became an adult, you were wired the way you were going to wire, and you might be a little happier or a little more sad, but that's the way it was going to be. And now we know that's not true. And the reason why we know that's not true is we had a couple of really important things going on at the same time. One of them is that we had increase in medical technology to be able to look at the brain in a way that we'd never had. And then we had some researchers at a lab in Wisconsin knowing that you could change because they had studied the behaviors of monks that did a lot of meditation and really intentionally engaged in a different experience in their lives. And what they saw in these guys, they had never seen in a human brain before. And what they realized is that with intentional practice and not reacting the way we've always been reacting, that we could actually change the way our brain functions. We change what's called anatomical changes, which means we actually change the structure of the brain. And we also have functional changes, which means that we change the way we respond because our brain is different. Okay, so this is a huge concept. And then once they found this out with all the monks, they re-researched it, and it's probably one of the most researched things now ever, because it was such a big finding. And so now it's like, okay, so what happens, can we change the brain if we do this activity, and we can change the brain if we do this activity. And what they found is that experience creates the change. So again, if nothing changes, nothing changes. But if you begin to change your experience, like in the power of pause, what does the power of pause do? The power of pause changes your routine way that you might react to something and gives you a different reaction. That's a different experience. So when you have that different reaction, that becomes your new experience. So now you're actually rewiring your brain by changing your experience. So now, I gave you the slide before, your wiring becomes your programming and affects all that you perceive. Well, now you've got new wiring. So you're actually perceiving your whole life from a different space because the functional wiring is different because you've changed some experience. Your biochemistry, we talked about your biochemistry, right? That your biochemistry are all the little biochemicals through your whole body, and that every cell and every organ in your body has receptor sites for various biochemicals. You watched a video on what cortisol does, how damaging cortisol is, the way that your body adapts in many, many, many different ways when it's flooded with cortisol, including just making more cortisol, making more cells that make cortisol, including just upregulating receptor sites, including even maybe changing the way that the gene functions, increasing your capacity for anxiety or depression disorders, stress disorders, right? So our biochemicals are responsible for how we're feeling at any given point in time. But when you change your experience, you change your biochemical imprint, right? So we begin to change, and again, biochemicals affect every cell and every organ in your whole body. So when you begin to authentically change your experience, you actually begin to change the biochemical imprint or the biochemical makeup of everything that's going through your body. So I talked a lot about cortisol and how damaging cortisol was. Well, there's another hormone there. Again, a hormone is something that does a kind of a biochemical that has a job to do. There's a hormone called oxytocin. Now, they're not exactly the opposite, but they many times function opposite. And oxytocin is one of the primary hormones of your calm and connection system. It makes us feel connected. It makes us have a positive outlook. We have something called the broaden and build theory, which makes us see opportunity. And we actually see differently when our body is steeped in oxytocin as opposed to cortisol. So cortisol is one of the primary hormones of your fear response system. Oxytocin is one of the primary hormones of your calm and connection system, and they can't be both elevated at once. So when cortisol is high, oxytocin is low, but the opposite is true too. So when you do anything to begin to lower your cortisol and increase your oxytocin, your calm and connection system becomes dominant. And again, anytime you have a biochemical in your body gets better at making that biochemical, better at processing that biochemical. So it's not just what's going on in the moment. Then you actually create a greater capacity to live from states of more of an oxytocin dominated system, right? So you're going to have better connections. You're going to see more positivity in your life, and then you're going to make decisions from seeing that positivity in your life. And it becomes, again, it's these little changes, but it starts to make that whole spiral become an upward spiral instead of a downward spiral. So, and your heart coherence, I didn't get too deep into this last time. I'm going to go briefly over it because we're going to talk about it again when we start talking about more of the tools. But your heart is about the size of your fist, and it sits in the middle of your chest. It drives me crazy when people think that their heart is over on their left side because they say the Pledge of Allegiance and with their hand on their left shoulder. Your heart is in the middle of your chest. It's a little bit bigger on the left side just because your heart is a muscle. It tilts a little bit just because that muscle is a little bit stronger, but it does sit in the middle of your chest. And then you have something called an SA node at the top of the right corner of your heart, and what that does is it sends an electrical impulse. Now your heart is muscle, so anytime muscle gets an electrical impulse, it contracts, and so that the contracting, your muscle is kind of hollow. Actually, it's got 4 chambers, but it's hollow, and so when the muscle contracts, it squishes the blood and the blood has a very distinct pattern that it follows. You have valves in your heart, and so it makes the blood flow in a certain pattern. So that electrical impulse is really hard. You can't live without it, obviously, and we define life by the beat of your heart. It's how we define life. When your heart stops that's when we would define that somebody dies, right? That's why you hear this all the time, somebody's brain dead, but they haven't been pronounced dead yet. Eventually their systems shut down and all that kind of stuff, but it's the heart that defines how we define life. So that electrical impulse is hugely important. Now that electrical impulse, it has, this is kind of what an EKG looks like, and you don't have consistent spaces between the beats. And I'm going to kind of go over this pretty quickly, and I know it's a little bit much to remember, but it's also in your book, and I will go over it again later. But the beat, this is kind of what the electrical impulse of your heart looks like. The space between the beat isn't consistent. You would think it would be. If your pulse is 60 beats a minute, you would think that it's 1 per second, but it's not. It might be 1.2, it might be 0.8, it might be 0.7. So your heart speeds up and slows down with every beat, and that's a good thing. It's a really good thing because it it shows that your heart is responding to your emotional needs, right? But if you pattern that, if you plotted that over a long period of time, so you have something called heart rate variability, and that means the space between your heart rate varies, and we can measure it. And so when we measure how the space changes, we call that heart rate variability. Now, if we plot that heart rate variability over a long period of time, it begins to make a pattern. And it's the pattern that we're more interested in. Because basically, the take-home message here is you have electrical patterning going through your body and brain every moment of every day. It's being sent from your heart, not from your brain. It's reaching your brain, but it's being sent from your heart. And it's reflecting your emotional state. And the electrical impulse from your heart is about 60 times stronger than the electrical impulse from your brain. So it's super strong. And so what does that mean? I mean, right now, I could, if we weren't COVID times, I could take you down to my lab and I could actually put electrodes just on your wrist and your ankles, and we could actually get an EKG. That electrical impulse is a really, really, really strong impulse. Okay, so at some level, it's felt in every cell and organ in your body. And again, what carries, what should you never touch if there's a live wire? Anything fluid, right? Your body, with all the blood in it, has a huge percentage of fluid in it. And so it conducts this electrical impulse. So at some level, every cell and every organ in your whole body is kind of picking up what this pattern, electrical patterning is, right? And again, I'm not talking about the speed. I'm talking about the pattern that it makes when it speeds up and slows down. It's like, I like to compare it to like an SOS, right? Or a Morse code. And that Morse code is constantly being sent through your body. And when your heart is really chaotic, it's like an SOS. Something's really wrong. And it's sending this electrical message all through your body. And it may not be coherent thought that you're picking this up, but you feel it. You feel it in every cell and organ in your body. Well, sometimes that Morse code is a really calm Morse code, and it's sending out messages of, no, you know what, we're good, everything's calm, and at some level you feel it in every cell and every organ in your body. And it's really important to know that it originates from your heart, because your electrical impulse doesn't come from your brain. Your brain doesn't beat your heart beats itself. And the reason why that's so important is because then that electrical impulse goes to different parts of your body. It just gets sent out to your whole body. It gets sent out. One of the really important places that it goes is back to your amygdala. And we talked about your amygdala and how that is the primary perception organ in your body. It's subconscious, but it picks up these chaotic patterns, and then it sends a message to the rest of your body to get more stressed out. So this is a loop, a feedback loop constantly between your heart and your brain, and then the rest of your body is picking up on this feedback loop. So at some level, you feel the difference, right? And so we talked a lot about what happens under your fear response system. Under your fear response system, the patterning, your heart rate variability patterning. Now, some researchers call this your level of coherence, is really chaotic, and so you feel it. Well, if you can shift to, again, we're talking about what happens when your calm and connection system takes over. So if you can shift to feelings of appreciation or feelings of gratitude, or just even calm the chaos, you have a whole different patterning through your whole system. And then those messages of a calm pattern are being sent. So it's being sent to your whole body feels it. It's being sent to your amygdala, so your amygdala automatically calms down. It's sent to your frontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that makes sense of things, right? So when you're calm, your frontal cortex is going to look for things in your environment that validate that calm feeling. When your heart rate variability is chaotic, your frontal cortex is going to look for things in your environment to validate that crazy chaotic feeling. So what's going on with your heart rhythm patterns at any given point in time is hugely important. And I wait till now to talk about it because that's one of the things that we can measure. We can really measure well when you begin to shift to states of calm and connection. Okay. The other thing that happens is with training, you can actually change some of the problematic perceptions that you've had in your past. And we're going to talk a lot more about this as, in several weeks, we get a little deeper into some of this material. But your brain doesn't know the difference between what's vividly imagined and what's true. So you can actually use your imagination in some of the guided meditations. We're going to get working with some imagery in some of the guided meditations and actually change some of what we call your emotional memory. Now, there's a difference between emotional memory and autobiographical memory. Autobiographical memory is the thing that you remember. Emotional memory is your response to a situation. Right, so we have a lot of responses that are stored in our programming because something has hurt us in the past and we're going to respond, right? I told you this, the story of my son and his helicopter accident, right? He was messing around, fell into a window. It was just a freak accident. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just fell into a window and the window cut his arm and he almost bled to death and had to be helicoptered to a trauma unit, and we didn't know if he was going to live or die. And obviously that was a big moment that took a big imprint in all of our amygdalas. But my own experience of that was then every time I heard a helicopter, right, my whole mind-body complex would react out of a state of sheer anxiety and fear. Now, is it appropriate for me to be walking across Cal Poly and all of a sudden, I have a full-on anxiety attack because I'm hearing a helicopter? No. That helicopter isn't a threat, but my amygdala was perceiving, because it's been a threat before, and I would feel the anxiety and feel the fear before I even saw the helicopter. I was hearing it subconsciously. My whole body was reacting, right? So that's what we call implicit memory. That's what we call emotional memory. It attaches your new perception to something that's happened in the past. But what happens is your amygdala is also just made up of neurons. So you can actually take memories like that and change the emotional impact. And I'm going to tell you in a couple of weeks how I really worked hard to do that with my son's accident. Now all I feel is gratitude when I hear a helicopter. I still can hear it before anybody else, but all I feel is gratitude, because I worked really hard in changing that perception and really, really going into some, changing that emotional experience for myself. And again, we're going to talk more about that as we go. So you can actually change your perceptions from problematic implicit memory, right? So we all have these reaction patterns. You wrote about your triggers, you wrote about your inner chatter. You can change the deeper reaction patterns that start off all those things. You can change the deeper reaction patterns that start your triggers. You can change the deeper reaction patterns that make your inner chatter talk about certain things, or incessantly remind you that you're not good enough, or incessantly remind you that, this person doesn't like you, or that person, or you're not good, or you're a imposter, or whatever that inner chatter always tells you. You're too fat, you're too ugly, we all have that inner chatter, and it's always telling us things all the time, but it's really based on what we call our implicit memory. So you can actually go back and you can actually rewire your implicit memory, because your amygdala is just made up of those neurons as well. So any part of your brain is made up of neurons, and any neuron has the capacity for neuroplasticity if you give it a different experience. So again, we're going to talk how to do that, but under your calm and connection system, you actually can change the way you are perceiving certain things, even when you had problematic perceptions in the past. And I give you some examples in the book about how that happens, how some examples of how it has happened in people that I've seen or people that I've worked with. So it's really important to understand you can actually fundamentally change your perception, the way you're perceiving your universe. And again, what comes from that, the behaviors and the reactions and choices, by intentionally and authentically switching to your calm and connection system. Now, the big question is, how do you authentically switch to your calm and connection system? And because it's not, like I said, it's not just as easy as I'm just going to force myself to think positive, because that doesn't work. Your calm and connection system, again, comes from the most inner part of your brain that's going to react to more of your authentic experience, not of what you're just trying to convince yourself of. So that's where we're going with the whole class from this point out, is how do we really begin to reduce our fear response? How do we really begin to cultivate our calm and connection system? Today is just about kind of reviewing about how those changes actually take place. I talked about how those changes are so damaging when they're on your fear response system. So today is really about understanding that when you get grounded in your calm and connection system, they completely change. That whole spiral of becoming completely changes. And so for me, my helicopter story, or my helicopter experience, was completely transformed. And I worked really hard, and I'm going to tell you how I did that. But for me, that was a completely transformational experience. I don't fall apart at hearing a helicopter anymore. I really don't. It's not like I'm just trying to talk myself out of it. I really, really don't. And I worked really hard on that, and we're going to talk about that in a few weeks about kind of how that whole transformation happened. So, so this is about rewriting your story, really, about changing your neural patterns, changing your biochemistry, changing your heart rhythm patterns when you actively and intentionally do two things: reduce your fear response system and cultivate your calm and connection system. And again, last week I also gave you the 4 steps of doing both of those. Recognize and release really kind of reduces your fear response system, but then replacing and restoring really actively cultivates your calm and connection system. So we have to do both. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. How do you begin to reduce your fear response system so you can actively cultivate your calm and connection system? So I want to bring you back to that message with my dad, right? Or the story about that morning with my dad. Had I not calmed myself first, I would have never been available to really connect with him the way I did. I had to reduce my fear response system first, and I did that on my own. I did the power of pause. I did another tool called present moment awareness that you're going to learn next week. And I really calmed myself first. And so then in that calm state, when I saw him, I was really able to actively engage. But had I not calmed myself first, I wouldn't have been able to. So again, it's a 2-pronged approach, and we're going to really talk about how do you apply the skills to do that, really starting next week. I talked about in the moment tools that you can just calm yourself right in the moment of stress, which are super, super, super important tools. Because if you just react the way you've always reacted, and then 10 hours later, you go sit down and meditate, it's still a good thing, but you're not going to be changing that moment. So in the moment tools are hugely important. We also talked about sustain tools. Those are the tools like the guided meditations where you really give yourself space and time. And so you're changing 2 different systems here. You're changing the system of really kind of being able to function most of the time from a grounded space, but you're also changing from in the moment tools, you're absolutely changing your response patterns in the moment. So both of those types are really important. And so last week I also talked to you about the learn to pause. It's the very first tool that we're talking about. I talked about it a lot last week. This week what we're going to do is you're just going to get really much, much deeper into that tool. This is the very first tool that you're going to use, and the very first tool that everything else gets based on. Because if you don't pause, and if you don't kind of just hit the pause button of that stress reaction, then you're never going to be able to implement any other tool. So we're going to get deeper into the power of pause this week. And you're going to kind of write about it and really think about it at a deeper level. I know you kind of wrote down areas that you might use it in your life last week, but we're just going to get a little bit deeper. So what we're going to do, first of all, I want to just remind you of what the power of pause, the steps of the power of pause. So number 1, you just need to recognize the trigger. When you're in the moment of being triggered, right? You just recognize it. This is what we call mindfulness, and I'm going to talk more about that next week. But mindfulness is that you recognize something, but you don't engage with it. It's almost like you hear this a lot, becoming the observer or becoming the witness. So you recognize it, but you don't evaluate it or suppress it. And then you disengage from its hold, right? If you can feel it kind of coming up in your body, you just relax, right? Or if you notice the emotion coming up, it's not like you're suppressing it, but it's like you're disengaging from its hold on you. It's almost like you're observing it as if it were somebody else's experience. And then you become the observer and be with it from a non-reactive, non-judgmental stance. You're going to hear that term a lot in the next week. And then you take several intentional breaths, including intentional sighs. There's so much in the power of a sigh. This is one thing I always tell my students: if you don't remember anything else, remember if you release the muscles around your eyes and you sigh, your whole body is going to calm down. And when your body calms down, you begin to see differently. So so you take a few breaths, including a couple intentional sighs, and then you just kind of let yourself focus on the experience of your breath. And then when you just kind of bring your whole body down, calm, pause in the reactivity of the moment, then you can better discern what you want to do. Okay, so that's just kind of the power pause. And again, that's the starting step. Sometimes that's just going to be it. That's all you can do, and that's good. Because what it does is it breaks that fear response spiral that we were talking about. But it also opens up the spaces for you to be able to do other tools. So what I want you to do, we're going to do a writing activity. And in this writing activity, what I want you to do is just, I'm gonna give you some time, and this is actually going to be your reflection. And you started doing this last week, but we're going to get way deeper into it, and this is going to be kind of lengthened out into your reflection. You're just going to do this one reflection this week, and as well as your summary of the practice. But what I want you to do, and this is on page 78 in Unstressed, if you don't have the paper version and you're using the electronic version, just look for the page that says Implementing the Power of Pause. All the electronic versions have different pages, so I can't give you the page, but if you look for the end of chapter 2, I think it is, the beginning of chapter 3, where it says Implementing the Power of Pause, I want you to do that. So list as many situations in your life. What I want you to do is I want you to just brainstorm. Just brainstorm, and I want you to think about all the situations in your life that you can think of where you would benefit from taking a moment to pause. Times that you usually get triggered, times that you might usually get upset, times that you might usually react in a way that's not positive for you. And I just want you to just brainstorm and list. And they're going to be from little things to big things. It might be, getting road rage on the freeway, or it might be when somebody looks at you a certain way, or it might be when, a parent or a friend or a boyfriend or a girlfriend says something that hits you in the wrong way. It might be something that, kind of touches more of your triggers a little bit more. But I want you to kind of just really think about all those situations. You can bullet them, or you can write them in long, kind of in a narrative form. Again, this is supposed to be stream of consciousness writing. I want you to put this all together in reflection, where you're not just listing the bulleted points, where you're really kind of writing that deeper, one-page, in-depth, single-spaced reflection about all of this. And then I want you to write what systems you can put in place to remind yourself. I mean, I get this from students all the time. It's just like, oh my gosh, I just wish I would have remembered to do the power of pause. So what can you do ahead of time? One of the things that really helps ahead of time is identifying the situations, the first thing that I asked you to do. Because then when that situation comes up, you're going to be more likely to remember it. But what can you do to help yourself remember? To do it, right? You got to change your experience. This is stuff that you just can't know about. Knowing about it isn't going to make a difference. It may be real cool to know about it, but it's not going to make a difference. The only thing that's going to make a difference is when you actually change your experience, when you actually implement it in your life. So I want you to kind of really, again, write a narrative about the things that you can do to remind yourself. How can you remind yourself to be able to pause in that moment? What benefits that you might, overall benefits, right? Overall benefits in your life of just being able to pause more often instead of being more reactive. And again, stream of consciousness writing. I want you to get kind of deep into this. Let the pen write you. Don't think about it too much. Don't answer the questions verbatim. I just really want the pen to write you. And then what benefits to some specific situations might you realize? Right? That morning with my dad, it was I mean, not that I would have ever thought that that would happen ahead of time, but that was a huge moment of just being able to calm myself in the moment of stress and be able to engage in a different way. So what are the benefits in specific situations? If you usually fly off the handle with your boyfriend and girlfriend, or you usually fly off the handle with your parent, or you usually get crazy stressed out when you're trying to figure out all the technology for your online stuff, or when you're really stressed out because you're trying to get your own homework done and you've got to help somebody else in the house, or the internet goes down, or you're having computer issues, or you don't know the technology. And again, the more that you get crazy in those spaces, the more that the cortisol floods your brain and you can't think, right? Cortisol carries what we call cortical inhibition, which means that you can't think. You can't remember what you know, right? So what can you do in those situations? What benefits to those specific situations if you could just calm yourself and then re-engage, reapproach that situation from a calm space? Because again, that broaden and build is where you find the opportunity, instead of fear response system is the restriction, right? You actually see restriction when your fear response system is in control. So when you're trying to get something done, and the more you get stressed out, the more restriction you're going to see, the more you're going to see that there are no possibilities or opportunities. You can calm yourself down and it's like, okay, so what can I do here? What are my options? What can I do? So I want you to really kind of think about more in depth about some of the specific situations that you might realize. So I want you to just take some time, pause the recording, think about some of these. And again, these are on page 78. I also want you to read kind of the part before that and the part after that. And then I want you to do the power of pause again 4 times a day. 4 times a day, and make sure that you are recording every time. And you don't have to write a big piece of, about it every time you record it. But recording it, it kind of goes back into that second piece that I'm asking you to do. When you record it, that's kind of a system in place that actually helps you remember the next time. Okay, so I have you record these for really important reasons. One is that if you go back and you look at the list later, it's like, wow, some of those situations really did change because I was able to calm myself. But another reason why I have you do that is because if you're routinely doing that, then it reminds you to do it the next time the situation may arise. Okay, so again, the whole power of pause reflection, doing the power of pause 4 times between now and when your module is due every day, making sure you're recording it. And then you're also going to write a summary, and you're also going to do the de-stress with Dr. Elaine guided audio again. So you'll write up that summary. So the 2 things that you'll be turning in are both the power of pause reflection and then the summary. Okay, have a great week.